We do have a few questions that came in through the chat, so if you want to kick it off.
Sure. Yeah. The first question from Irwin is, what about China's pressure on Chinese immigrants?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk these days in Washington of what's called transnational repression, which is in some ways how China reaches across borders to put pressure, oftentimes to put pressure on people with ties to China in order to try and keep them silent, to keep them from talking about things that are happening in China. And I've done stories on some of these people who are here in Washington who are feeling the long reach of the party. Oftentimes, they are, for example, people like Uyghur Americans who are here trying to talk about those internment camps that were set up in Xinjiang some years ago. And they've had family members that disappeared that are in the camps or in the prison system in Xinjiang, and they want to speak out about it. And China says, well, threatens them by having police, for example, in Xinjiang contact other family members of theirs and saying, well, if your relative in the US keeps talking about this issue, then one of you might go to prison also, or we'll keep your family member who's already in prison or in a camp there longer. And so there definitely is this effect. I think it's not that widespread. I think it's very targeted. I think that they're reaching out to very specific individuals. And I know Chinese who often, speak out about some of the issues in China, but they have no contact with officials in China or with officers from security agencies. So it's not, I don't think it's a widespread phenomenon, but I think it does happen with certain people who are speaking out in a very political manner about what's going on in China.
Hey, we have a question from Sandra. How are you feeling about U.S. China relations as the second Trump administration takes hold? And do you think it will be difficult for journalists to cover?
That's a good question. The difficulty of covering it in there's, I covered both the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, and they're very different. The first Trump administration, they're not as disciplined, about their messaging. In some ways, my colleagues and I would hear more differing voices on the inside about the debates that were going on. And you might hear about them from the administration, you might hear about them from the Hill, from Congress. But I felt like in some ways you could get more of a window into the internal debates that were happening. It wasn't, it's funny because, people talk about the potential for fascism, for authoritarianism. Obviously, Trump has shown some of those tendencies in his public remarks. But in terms of discipline, the first Trump administration is very much not, for example, a Leninist style organization. There were many loose parts of it, and you could make contact with them and learn about some of the things that were happening internally. I think the Biden administration, is more disciplined in terms of its messages and hides the internal debates going on better from public view in many ways. I think many White House reporters and others would agree with me on that. But Trump covering foreign policy and Trump was much more unpredictable because it wasn't done through an interagency process most of the time, where there would be these discussions, and then there would be a lot of meetings, and then there would be a decision that would be made. Instead, oftentimes Trump would send out a tweet late at night that would have some proclamation involving policy, and then you would have to try and figure out, is he serious about what he's saying? Do other people in the administration agree with him? Will they carry it out, or will they push back against it? And so it was very chaotic in that sense, and that made it harder. In that sense, it was more difficult to cover. I think that obviously U.S.-China tensions were very high under the first Trump administration. They've also been very high at many moments in the Biden administration. For instance, when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, or when the Pentagon discovered the spy balloon over the U.S. So I don't think that tensions were that much lower in the current era. and I expect tensions to remain high in the second Trump administration. I think there is a huge element of unpredictability in how business leaders who are close to Trump, people like Elon Musk, who do a lot of business with China, will, how their suggestions might conflict with those of more hawkish national security advisors, people like Marco Rubio, the incoming Secretary of State, if he's confirmed, or Michael Waltz, the incoming national security advisor, who are more of like, in some ways, focused on the national security aspects of the competition and not as interested in commercial dealings with China, which Musk or others around Trump might be interested in. That dynamic played out a lot in the first Trump administration as well.
We have a question from Liz. What do you personally feel about being on WeChat and TikTok?
I'm pretty cautious when I use WeChat. I learned that, in my time in China, because we know for a fact that Chinese security agencies, the police, can monitor WeChat. So I'm very cautious when I use it to contact people I know in China. I use it mainly just to, check up on how people are doing, or to, if I'm in China, just to say, oh, let's meet up and have a meal. I rarely use it here in the US. I just don't feel that comfortable using it because I'm a very public figure who has written a lot on China and who's on the radar of the Chinese government. The TikTok I don't use. I know friends of mine use it, but no one in my household has TikTok or uses it. I think that the discussion of whether it's a national security risk is theoretical. Any of these tools can be weaponized by a government like that in China in a moment of crisis. I think the potential is always there. They haven't, from what my conversations with U.S. officials who monitor it, they have not weaponized it yet in any concrete or substantial manner. And I think the question that is more relevant to me as a parent is like whether letting your kid use TikTok contributes to their, personal and mental growth, or whether it inhibits it. That's the more salient question in my mind.
I love that your daughter is not yet using TikTok. I also don't have my son using TikTok, although my parents do communicate with me on WeChat. So I will try to get them off the platform to like Signal or
I
something.
rather like it's better for them to use another platform to communicate with you, in my opinion.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate all the audience questions. That is all the time that we have today. We are past 7. So thank you everyone for joining. And thank you especially, Ed, for gracing us with your presence and the story of your father and your book.
And
Thanks.
thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
Tracy. Thank you, Tracy
Yeah.
and Ed. It was really great. I really appreciate your time. And thank
Yeah.
you everyone for joining.
Thanks. And have a great holiday season to everyone.
You too.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.